And welcome into a special edition of Market Talk. I am your host, Jesse Allen. Great to have you here. MarketTalkAg.com. That is where you can find us on the web. You can also find us via that handle on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram as well. It's all at Market Talk Ag. And on your favorite podcast sources, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, radio.com, Amazon, Audible, and so many more. Got a great guest today to bring in here for the program. He is someone, his company, very fascinated by what they're doing. Ag Economic Insights, AEI is the company, and we have one of the co-founders with us here today. David Widmar is our guest here on Market Talk. Let's bring him in. David, how are you today?
Doing well. Well, thanks for having me on. Glad to join you.
Yeah, I appreciate you being part of the program here. We were talking a little bit during NAFB Trade Talk and trying to get this set up, and I'm glad we have a little bit of a longer window to chat because, as I said there at the open, very fascinated about what you guys are doing with AEI. And I think just for starters, for those who are listening or watching at home, can you give us just a background on the company, just kind of a short rundown of what you guys do and how you got started?
Yeah, so we're Agricultural Economic Insights, aei.ag is where you can find us. We started about 6.5 years ago. Brent Gloy and I were both working at Purdue University, agricultural economists by training, and we recognized sort of an opportunity to not provide breaking news, but a breakdown of the news, and specifically the perspectives that two economists might have. So we started writing a weekly blog post. They're still on our website. They're free to take a look at. And it's generally data-driven insights. So we take a topic that's on everyone's mind. Maybe it's ending stocks, or maybe it's farm income. And we go see what the data are, and we summarize the data, and we try to drive that to key insights, which of course are helpful for the decision makers, because we start with data, and then we got to process that a little bit to get some knowledge, and then we get insights where we focus, and then we help the decision maker with the implications and then the actions or the decisions they might be taking.
Mm-hmm.
So that's been our organization. We do a lot of speaking with producer groups or those who work with producers. We kind of, our audience are producers or those who sit across the table from producers and help them throughout their growing season. And so we have the blog, and we do some speaking, and then we started a few new subscription-based services, AEI Premium, which is even more of our content, and then a decision tool that helps size up uncertainty.
Well, a lot of great stuff you guys are doing and have been doing over the last 6 years. And I think just for starters, this is a great thing to have here on Market Talk because obviously we deal with daily, weekly trends, but you guys are more of that forecast that is out a few months, 6 months, whatever the case may be. And I want to get your thoughts just to start um, on where the ag economy is at right now. And obviously in the future side, we've been seeing a little bit of a rebound, some run up with corn and beans and things of that nature. We've seen some of these numbers get adjusted, especially that November WASDE report from USDA. What are you looking at? What is your team looking at as we get into the beginning of next year? Like, what are your thoughts on where this ag economy is at right now and where it's going?
Yeah, it's a great question. I like how you set this up. We try to look at sort of the 30,000-foot picture. We're trying to look at the landscape and all the actors that are involved. So if there's one word that I could use to summarize 2020, it's whiplash. And so we've had a lot of optimism to begin 2020 with the phase one trade deal that was rumored and looming and then landed. And then markets sort of sputtered around there and actually traded lower throughout the February and first part of March. And then, of course, we slammed on the brakes with the pandemic, and oil traded negative, and everyone was asking, can corn go negative as well? And then there was sort of, I call it about 7 weeks in August and September where the USDA came in with a big yield number for that August WASDE, but just a few days beforehand, there was the Iowa storm, the big windstorm. And so everyone sort of put a big asterisk by that. And we knew that that data were going to maybe adjust. We debated how much of the adjustment. And then the weather started getting dry, and we had some dryness. And then the first week of September was the USDA's net farm income estimates. And then they came out with the September WASDE, which pulled yields lower. And then the third week of September, we had the CFAP2 program. And so that's just sort of been the accelerant, the stimulus. So there's been a lot of stimulus in the US economy, but also the ag markets and the ag economy. I think as we move into 2021, I got a long answer for you today. I apologize. But as we get into 2021, we got to keep an eye on that. We got to keep an eye on what's happening in the US economy. Will there be another stimulus working through? Will this low interest rate environment continue? And we also got to keep an eye on China and the trade story that's been pretty positive, really, the last 3 or 4 months. How sustainable is that? And I think the third part here is weather in South America, and also weather here in the U.S. The drought monitor map looks pretty ugly. We're not focused on it, right? We're not thinking about it because we don't have a growing season. But that drought monitor map was something we were thinking about in June and July, and we were kind of telling people be careful in June and July. It it really wasn't at a level that was warranting concern, and now sort of attention is waned on that, but
Mhm.
the drought monitor keeps intensing. So that's why we're watching U.S. economy, some global markets and trade, and the weather.
Yeah, and that's all great insights, David. And looking at, for instance, China, I think that that's really the biggest one that stands out to me, and it stood out to other folks I talk to on the show daily. China's been buying and buying and buying and buying at a rapid pace, but it's a question of, are all these sales actually going to get delivered? Where are we going to go with that? What could happen with a new administration moving in for the U.S. In 2021? And how much, if you had to say out of those three things, would you say that China and trade issues is probably the biggest, or are they all pretty equal?
I think China right now might be the biggest question mark that we had to think about for the first 3 months.
Okay.
Um, I think that's where. So I guess the next 4 months, right? December
Mhm.
2020. What's going to happen as the administration sort of wraps things up, and then the new administration comes in January, February, March. China was kind of hinting around maybe they wanted to renegotiate phase one, so we're going to open the lid on that. I don't know. That could be some challenges. I think um, everyone's wondering if we're in a equilibrium or if we're going to sort of shake the snow globe again and see where things sort
Mhm.
out. As I think about China, um, there's a long run story here where China keeps buying more and more. They keep turning to the world for more of their production, and that's a huge underlying positive story. I think the next question is how big of a player the U.S. plays. And I think in the next 4 months we're going to see if the phase one agreement is going to keep us in equilibrium, or if we're going to sort of move to another wave of uncertainty and trade uncertainty. I think the interesting element here is the tariffs are still in place, right? Those soybean
Mhm.
tariffs are still in the books. They're just waiving those, and so um, we have to see how phase one agreements progressing, how the new administration perceives that. The market doesn't really care if we hit the phase one target or not. What the market cares about is China is back as a large buyer of U.S. soybeans and as well as corn, and so we got to see how long that sustains itself um, through the first part of 2021 and then next fall as well. Uh, Last note here, there's a lot of seasonality in China purchases, right?
Mhm.
And so that's why I also mentioned the first 3 to 4 months. We got to see how much of the purchases, how that final book of purchases fills out. We got a lot of, it's kind of like developing pods in a soybean, right? We have a lot of potential, but we got to finish up those pods. We got to finish up that export. And so, how big is that finish? Did we front load a bunch of those, and we won't see as much activity, purchase activity in January and February, or are we going to see that sort of continue to pace out as we might expect? So that's some of the uncertainty. We got to keep an eye on that.
Sure. Well, and I think for now, producers in the U.S., we've seen the markets here the last few weeks, last couple of months. Soybeans are around that $12 mark. Didn't think we would see that. I don't, back beginning of this year, corn is chugging along, not as rapidly, but I mean, we're sitting in that 430 range now on corn, and I think that's got to have a lot of producers here in the U.S. at least happier than they were at the beginning of this year.
Yes, the outlook is for soybeans is definitely improved. Corn has improved as well. It's improved a year over year. It's improved, especially 6 months over.
Mhm.
Um, 320 was where that December 2020 corn futures contract was trading in August. I mentioned the 7 weeks in August and September.
Hmm.
I didn't mention that corn actually hit that low there in the middle of August, end of August. And so we've climbed our way out quite a bit. So things are starting to feel a little bit better. Producers need to take this opportunity to reevaluate their budgets for next year, their current financial situation, and revisit that risk management plan. We had a lot of sleepless nights, I think, over the summer, and we got to think back. What were our concerns, and how can we build up our risk management plans and our financial position to take advantage of the turn of fortune we've seen?
Well, and that's a great point you mentioned, and we talk about it on this show quite a bit. How it comes down to your risk management plan, your operation, your finances. There's not a one size fits all when it comes to the farm, when it comes to marketing. It's about finding what works for you and your operation. And again, yeah, now is the time to be thinking about for next year, based off of the information we have in front of us right now.
Yeah, so we have to start making our plans and expectations, and we got to
Mhm.
update those plans and expectations as new information becomes available. You know, I always like to saying nobody saw it coming. Well, that's probably not actually ever true, right? There were people who maybe saw it before other people, and so we got to realize that we have to be looking for opportunities, and chance favors the prepared mind. Now is the time to be getting prepared and making those plans so we can take advantage of it when it's not as obvious how it might play out to the broader market.
Yeah, and David, you mentioned AEI Premium, and that's a lot more of your insights and knowledge into what's going on with the current markets. Can you talk about that a little bit, and just how folks can get involved with AEI Premium if they wish to?
Yeah, so we started writing weekly blog posts, and we said, well, we'll quit writing when we run out of ideas. And ideas are like bunny rabbits. You get a couple of them, and then before you know it, you have more than you can manage. So we have a lot of ideas. And how do we continue to share those ideas? And AEI Premium is a subscription pathway on our website. And the first thing you get is the content. And we cover a lot of topics. Again, we're not breaking the news, we're breaking down the news, data driven insights, and the content we have are stuff that you and I just talked about, but also a section we call ideas that make us better. And so these are ideas that are mental models that you can apply for problem solving. And we're always adding to that. And then we have another section called what we're thinking about memos. These are questions we don't have the answers to, but we have sort of a framing up to challenge your thinking. So that's the content. Then we also have the Ag Forecast Network, and that's a decision tool that I think helps listeners of this podcast, but those in agriculture who want to get serious about uncertainty. It's very tempting to throw our hands up in the air and say, "Oh, it's so much uncertainty. What am I to do about it?" I'm just at the whims of uncertainty. But there's an opportunity here to actually increase our capacity here, and so we take a lot of questions, Jesse, are like this: will corn markets rally, or do you think corn prices are going to go higher? And you and I can talk all day about that, but at the end of the day, we're going to have different um, ideas about what it means for corn prices to go higher.
Hmm.
And if we have bad questions, we're going to get bad outputs. So there's a saying in data science, junk in, junk out. So we take this uncertainty and we frame it in a way that everyone's on the same page. So what's the probability of the December 2021 corn futures contract getting over 425 between today and August 31st, 2021? Now, that's very precise and
Hmm.
that's very specific. And we've opened that question about 30 days ago, and you've seen the expectations turn higher. And what you do is you log on, you read it, you share your expectations. You can see the consensus or the average of all the other users. But the real gem here is you update your expectations. You leave notes, and you can see how your thoughts and expectations evolve and change over time. So the content and the decision tool, we have a lot of commodity market questions, but also farm economy questions. We're watching for another stimulus. We're watching the U.S. economy. We're watching government payments in 2021. So a lot of things that we're keeping an eye on. But the whole goal here is to move past the noise, focus on the key metrics that we can sort of glide through, and focus on those and how our expectations change as new information becomes available.
And that's one of the things that's so fascinating to me about what you guys are doing with AEI, David, is especially with that Outlook tool and the ability to take notes, keep everything there. If I'm a producer and I'm thinking a certain way in January, and then some of these variables come along and changes things in March, it's nice to have everything tracked there. And I think that's the beauty of where we are at today, just the amount of technology, and specifically the amount of technology throughout agriculture, whether it be in the tractor cab or at your fingertips on your phone or your laptop. It's just amazing the tools available to help producers.
Yeah, so there was a great book written in the '90s called Moneyball by Michael Lewis. We've probably seen the movie or read the book. And the idea here was that uh, the decision-making process for these baseball recruiters had some flaws in it, and they weren't making the best recruits. They weren't making the best decisions. And so the main character of this book created an algorithm or a black box or a formula to recruit the best players based on some so that was a way to overcome our faults in our decision making process. We're humans; we have lots of faults in our decision making process, but that's really popular today. This data, this AI, this idea of creating algorithms. But there's another way of upgrading our thinking, and Michael Lewis wrote a second book that's not as quite as popular called The Undoing Project, and it was about two psychologists who won the Nobel Prize in economics, and it was all about how I recognize the ways that humans make those flaws,
Mhm.
and our work is on the other side of this data side. How can we upgrade our thinking? How can we cultivate our thinking so that way we have tools that are in our tractor cabs and our computers that help us make better decisions, but also upgrade our own thinking so now we can pursue those harder topics? It's an open question. Technology, does it make our life easier, or does it allow us to move on to the harder questions? And that's where our work's at. We're going to help you move on to the harder questions, and we'll give you some tools to solve those harder questions.
Well, David, I think let's move on to another topic of what AEI is doing. And, you talk about technology and we discuss all that. Well, back in the 1980s, we didn't necessarily have all of this technology. And we obviously had the farm financial crisis. And you guys have a new podcast series called Escaping 1980. And it's kind of your look back at the farm crisis of the 80s. Can you talk about that and just how that idea came about?
Yeah, so the question we get asked the most as we're working with producers, meeting with producers, is how do today's conditions compare to what we saw in the 1980s? And history is often that measuring stick that we use when we get into uncertain times or unfamiliar times. And given the decline in net farm income, given the increase in total debts that we see in the farm sector, an increase in total farm sector debts, but also a trade deal, a trade partnership turning sour reminds everybody and has echoes or rhymings of the 1980s. And that's a hard question. We wrote a lot of blog posts over the years, but that's a hard topic to answer in a blog post or in a 5 minute response. And so we ventured out. My co-partner Brent Gloy and I partnered with freelance rural writer Sarah Mock, and we put together a 7 episode podcast series to look at the 1980s. It's called Escaping 1980. You can find it anywhere you listen to podcasts. You can learn more on our website, aei.ag. But it steps back and says, what were the 1980s, what led up to the 1980s, and how has the 1980s continued to impact us today? Broadly speaking, all of us in agriculture have been impacted by that decade and in the crisis, the farm financial crisis. And we either lived through it and we carry those scars or those lessons, or we grew up hearing about the lessons of the 1980s. And so there's been a long shadow cast from that decade, and we all live in the shadow.
Well, very fascinating that you guys did this. And I know I've heard throughout this year some producers worried that we were going to fall back into the 80s this year. Were we going to see this crash? What's going to happen? But at least in my opinion, I wouldn't say we are there. And I'm sure maybe you guys talk about this a little bit in your podcast, but I would say we're definitely better off than we were in the 80s right now.
It is it's a great question, and I think all of us carry around the stories, and
Yeah.
it feels similar or different depending on our experience and our recollection. Um, there are some major differences. One that comes to mind is interest rates and inflation.
Mhm.
We had really bad inflation in the 1970s, And then we got a handle on that inflation with a run up in interest rates. And that impacted that early part of the 1980s more than most of us fully appreciate. On one hand, it made it really hard to service debt, but higher rates of interest also have a gravity effect on asset values. And so when interest rates shot up, farmland values collapsed. And farmland values actually had interest rates going the wrong way and income's going the wrong way. So there's a double whammy there. That's just one difference. Another difference that's probably relevant to your listeners is, in May, we were really worried about 20+% ending stocks on corn, that early WASD report estimate. In the 1980s, about the middle of that decade, ending stocks to use for corn was about 60+%. So this was the equivalent in 2020 terms as like a 8 or 9 billion bushel carryover, which is unfathomable. So the 80s were really, really bad, really, really challenging. That's not to make light of where we are today, but it's simply to point out we have to be careful when we use analogies and lessons learned. We got to make sure we properly apply them.
Well, we got to be careful and use the tools that are available to us, including all the great things that you guys are doing with AEI. And David, any other final thoughts you want to share here today on Market Talk?
I think it's again, encourage everyone to check out our website or go back to the podcast Escaping 1980. We're on episode 4. It's going to get released this week in 7 total episodes. I think the second one might be of most interest to your listeners. We actually start back in 1972, and a few big things happened in 1972. The first one was Richard Nixon flew to China and shocked the world by beginning diplomatic relations again, restarting diplomatic relations with China. And of course, it would take decades, but that was the first step in the journey that we've taken with trading with China. And interestingly, the trade war today. The second thing that happened in 1972 was the Great Grain Robbery. And that's when Russia surprised us and kind of called our bluff here and bought a lot of wheat in a short period of time and shocked the whole world. So 1972 is where a lot of the stories start to begin in both today, it's the farm economy, but also what became the farm financial crisis of the 80s.
Well, it's something that I know I will have to check out, and I would encourage my listeners to check out the podcast as well and everything that you guys have available out there. Again, what's that website, David?
aei.ag.
Very simple, aei.ag. David Widmar with AEI Ag Economic Insights. We appreciate you joining us here on Market Talk, and we'll have to have you on the program again in the future. But for now, I appreciate it.
Thanks so much. Looking forward to it.
David Widmar, our guest today with AEI Ag Economic Insights. This has been a special edition of Market Talk. Find us online, markettalkag.com, and you can find us Facebook, Twitter, Instagram as well. It's all at Market Talk Ag, and on all your favorite podcast sources, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and many more. I'm your host, Jesse Allen. Have a great rest of the day.